Well, welcome back, everyone, to our CSLI live stream event with Josh and Sean McDowell, defending the faith for a new generation. We've had two wonderful sessions so far. Sure appreciate all that Josh and Sean have shared with us, and I think we're getting a perspective on today's world, on the culture we live in, and a generation of men and women and young boys and girls who are growing up in really a very different world than many of us grew up in. And yet we know the gospel is the same wonderful gospel of God's grace and goodness and salvation, but we need to find ways to more effectively share and live out that faith. And so we're just grateful for what we're learning today about how to do that. And so we're moving on now then to our third session. We're going to address passing the faith to the next generation. So Josh and Sean, invite you to take it on from here, and then we'll have another question and answer time following your conversation together. Again, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been wonderful, and we're excited to hear what you're going to say now.
Thank you. This is a treat, and this is some of our favorite part to interact like this. How you doing, Dad?
I am doing absolutely incredible.
Oh, good. Well, that's awesome.
I
We're
like those
actually
shoes in the background there. I like your tennis shoes.
kind of fun, huh? That's from your grandson, actually. You know the story behind that. Well, our goal here, and we've done this a couple times before, is to try to give people some practical tools in light of what you talked about in the perfect storm and how to reach Gen Z. So I'm going to make some comments, but just kind of guide the conversation and ask you along the way. How have you taught at 1,200 universities, 5 decades plus? How has the way you present the gospel changed or not changed to young people during that time?
Well, the Gospels had to be presented in a way that, say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the issue was there's a problem in the world. And whenever you spoke and everything, you had to apply the gospel to world situations. Over the last 30, 35 years, it switched to where I have a problem. Instead of there's a problem in the world and all the demonstrations on university campuses and all, it's I have a problem. And gradually had to switch to a greater application to the individual and not just to the culture around. Instead of confronting the culture, confronting the individual with truth. And that's probably the biggest change I've seen. And as a result, I would bring in my testimony more often, and I would emphasize you. You need to make a decision. You have a problem, not just there's a problem in the world, which you caused. But anyway, so that's what I would see as the difference.
So obviously the gospel doesn't change, but the lens by which people approach it through kind of this individualistic approach, you're trying to tailor it to make sure the gospel makes sense to them and calling them to a decision. Is that what your story functions to do? Or does it connect it to a life at like, okay.
Truth never changes, but how you present truth better change. Because culture changes, people change, ideas change, and you need to adjust it to apply it to the culture where you are. But here's the thing is, if you don't understand young people, say if you're ministering to young people, if you don't understand them, you'll probably miss the mark with truth and the gospel.
So I'm curious, what are the big questions that you're receiving today from young people? Because for me, some of the biggest questions that I find they're asking, and some of the Gen Z data backs this up, is that there's a lot of questions about the intersection of science and faith and what that means. That's always kind of come up. Some of the other questions, of course, are related to the LGBTQ conversation. I get questions about this still all the time. Third one is kind of this problem of evil in terms of injustices and bad things that Christians have done seem to be some of the objections in the mind of this generation. As you speak and write and talk to young people today, are those the ones you get, or do others kind of bubble to the surface that tend to be common objections or questions they have?
I'm in ministry now 57 years? Holy cow. Man, I'm an old man. Woo! But in all these years, there's always several of the basic questions. And you hit on two of them, always. One is the problem of good and evil. What's going on in the world, and how can a good God allow evil, etc. Second, come on, Josh. Second, the whole issue between science and evidence and truth and all. That's always been there, always been there. And so those two that's always there. The ones we see now is LGBTQ, etc.
Okay.
You don't get much in gay marriage anymore like you did 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And the other one, which almost always comes up, is the things, and you touched on it's a little different than I broke it out into two, is that look at the evil things that have been done in the name of Christ. And how can you justify that? Why should I come to Christ when so much evil has been done?
My experience, I'm curious if you'd agree with this, is I often say that a big question people used to have is Christianity true? So you could go on a college campus and you could make a case and people would demand evidence. Now, increasingly in the minds of many of this generation is it relevant? And is it good? It's kind of those two questions. Number one, does it even matter to me? And if I think it does matter, I don't think Christianity is good. So I won't even entertain that it's true before I think that it's good. Is that how you see it in your experience as well?
Absolutely. It's gone from objectivity to subjectivity, to is it true to is it relevant? And this is why I will say so often in interviews and others that probably the greatest apologetical question today is Christianity good? You wouldn't have had that 30 years ago. You wouldn't have had that. Nobody would ask you that. Today, it's huge. Now, some of the reasons for the change in culture is some of what I spoke on earlier with the C.S. Lewis Institute, is that we've gotten an overload from the internet. People are now, you sit here and you're exposed to things in China, everything personally. You connect with it. It's like the student shooting down in Florida. Well, those in Minnesota rioted. Why? Because the video, the direct live video, everything, you're connected virtually to it. And this is happening all over the world. And so whenever a pastor falls morally something else, now you might say thousands upon thousands hear about it, where it used to be maybe 100 people at the max. And so the internet has changed a lot of that, which I kind of like.
Now, when I look at this generation, one of my conclusions is they need a worldview, like a funnel, to decide what's true, what's false, and relationships. Yet in reality, this really isn't anything new. It's timeless. We see this in the Gospels, that Jesus would build relationship with people and he would talk about truth. Your ministry has been very unique in the sense that you did both. You have these parenting materials. You also have why wait materials about sexual purity. And then you have evidence that demands a verdict and books like More Than a Carpenter. Why did you take this truth approach and this relational approach to ministry? And is that still as relevant and as important today as it's ever been?
Absolutely, it is. The reason I did it, I take apologetics very seriously. I take what I feel God has called me to do as a great privilege. I don't take it lightly. I think I'm one of the luckiest people in the world to do what I do. And as an apologist, you're committed to truth. And I'm an apologist over the years has been mainly to truth in young people. Okay, if you really want to impact young people with truth, you've got to impact their parents. I don't care what anyone says. You've got to impact their parents. And so we would go into a city. I would go in and I'd spend several hours with the key pastors in the entire city, talking about truth and everything, and the need in young people and all. Then would come back, and all this was done by bus to like 80 cities. Then we would come back on a tour and deal with parents and a parent seminar and how parents can relate to their kids, how they can build a type of relationship where their kids will listen to them when they talk about truth. And then third, we would come back and reach young people. So it was a three-pronged approach. First, the leadership of the city, then the parents, and then the young people. And if you want to reach young people, you've got to deal with sexuality. Probably one of the biggest barriers to the Christian faith is a misuse and misunderstanding of sexuality. And so I figured if I really am sincere in what I do, I've got to address the number one, or at least one of the top barriers to young people coming to Christ, the moral issue. And so that's why I dealt with youth, with parents, and with morality.
Now, one of the
And
phrases
it
that
hasn't
you,
changed much today either.
yeah, I think you're right about that. One of the phrases that you coined that I think is not only insightful but really practical is that rules without relationships leads to rebellion. What do you mean by that?
I add several things to that. Rules without relationships lead to rebellion. Truth without relationships leads to rejection. Discipline without relationships leads to rebellion, hurt, and bitterness.
Hmm.
Like Clinton used to say, President Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, it's the economy. I say, it's the relationship, stupid, it's the relationship. Harvard University released a study that took 80 years. I can't imagine. I just can't imagine doing an 80-year study. And they followed about 800,000 people, and then there's their children for 80 years. They wanted to find out, is there a key to success in life, to happiness, and to health? Success, happiness, and health. After 80 years, one of the, not the founder, he was dead of this study, but one of that was working with the study from Harvard said, we discovered this. The key to success, health, and happiness is relationships, relationships, and relationships.
Wow.
Period. Whoa.
Wow.
And I believe here, I've always seen it, that if parents, two things, if parents try to pass their faith on to their children and they don't have a relationship with them, you'll get rebellion, you'll get rejection, except in the most rare situation. If I know my mom loves me, I know my dad cares about me, then they'll pretty well reject what you say. Second is to model it. If you do not have a model in your life that your children look up to, admire, then they usually won't listen to you about Jesus and the Bible and church. Why? Well, I don't like what my mom and dad have. They go to church, so why should I go to church? I'll end up having what mom and dad have. Why should I come to Jesus? My mom and dad's talking about Jesus all the time and that what Jesus done in their life. Well, I don't like their life. So why should I talk about Jesus or come to Jesus? Well, my mom and dad all the time is reading the Bible, quoting the Bible, and saying how the Bible helps them to live. And the kid is saying, and why should I read the Bible? I don't like what mom and dad has. If I read the Bible, I'll become like them, and I don't like who they are. And so relationships and modeling, without that, it doesn't matter how much you present truth to your kids. You'll 80% fail.
You're familiar with this study that I cite by Vern Bankston from the University of Southern California. And this was a 35-year study, 3,500 people, 4 generations. And they were studying faith transmission from one to the next. And it wasn't just Christianity, it was any faith, trying to see what was statistically the most significant. And their conclusion was, as you know, a quote, warm relationship with the Father. And that doesn't downplay the importance of the mother, but the reality is the dad tends to be more of a wild card, so shows up statistically as being more significant. What's maybe one or two practical things you've written? One of my favorite talks that you have is just called
Let,
the
let me
seven
interrupt here.
A's.
I
Go
think
ahead.
one of the things for that, Sean, is that the mother's taken for granted. That
Yep,
she'll be there, she'll be loving, she'll be relational, etc. The father isn't.
that's right.
The father isn't taken for
Yeah,
granted. As a result, it
that makes
affects a
sense.
child's view of the dad. So when the dad is there, does do it, has a relationship, the impact is even greater because it's less expected.
Mm. Well, talk about
Go ahead.
one of my favorite talks that you have is called the 7 A's, and I'm sure people could Google it and read. We don't have time to go through 7 specific steps of building relationships with kids, but what's maybe one or two? Because we've talked about relationships a lot. If you had kind of a go-to 1 or 2 point that just seems to be the most effective at building relationships with this generation, what would it be?
Well, one would be affection,
Hmm.
because affection and love plays a key role in any relationship mode.
Hmm.
And I don't think you can truly have a relationship with somebody else or a child if they don't truly have two things. One, they know you love them, and second, they trust you.
Hmm.
In the Harvard study, they said the one factor to relationships is trust. And if you don't have
Hmm.
trust, they said, you cannot have a meaningful, significant relationship with one else. And they said trust in the aspect is one, the person keeps their word, and second, you know they have your back. They'll always be there. So the two things with trust. And so I would say affection is key.
Hmm.
Uh, and they're also important. The other one is approach. Approach their world. Why do we always have to have the kids eat what we want to eat, go to the restaurant we want to go to, watch the program we want to watch? Why can't we step into their world? They're human, at least most kids are. Uh, they're human. Um, and so if we show affection and we approach their world, it says, my mom and dad care about what I think. They care about what I
Hmm.
care about. They care about what I feel about. And when a child builds that, it builds in a tremendous trust and respect for the parent. And
Hmm.
when you have that, they'll listen to you. So I would
That's
say
good.
affection and approach.
Affection is great. I often say when I talk about this generation that a digital like cannot replace a physical hug. And I think one thing we've seen out of this COVID and quarantine, I saw it with my own kids, is that you can only Zoom enough. You can only FaceTime enough. As valuable as it is, hence we can do this conference, which is awesome. This generation needs a face to face connection to somebody that they're with in present. And a lot of the suffering that's happening today is because people don't have that face to face connection. And that affection has always been important, but you can almost argue is more important than it's ever been. Now, how did you learn? You did not have a model of parents that love each other. You didn't have a model of how to parent. I know you've shared your story. Probably people listening are familiar with my grandfather. Your dad was the town drunk, just a very broken family growing up. How did you learn to be a great husband, but in particular, a great father?
I would say I'd have to attribute a lot to my oldest sister, Shirley,
Hmm.
who was old enough to be my grandmother almost. My
Hmm.
folks were almost 50 when they had me. Um, she had the type of marriage to stand and the character and qualities that as a young person I admired. And it's things I didn't see in my other brothers and sisters so much and didn't see in my parents.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I would say Shirley had quite a profound impact on me. And as a result, I admit I was just a little kid. I mean, she'd take me somewhere and say, "Well, how old's your son?" We always thought she was my mother,
Huh.
and I had so many discussions with her on these issues. The other, I knew I didn't want what my parents had,
Mm.
but I wasn't exactly sure what I did want. I knew I didn't want that. So one thing I did, I watched other people.
Hmm.
At church, I'd watch people, men who seemed to have a really excellent marriage and relationship with their kids. And I would try to get to know them. I think of four men. Ended up, I would be invited to their house for dinner and everything because I was a single guy and all. And I'd watch their lives and see what they do that made a difference from others. And so, in other words, I say I plagiarized.
Hmm.
I took what they did and applied it to my life,
Hmm.
and it worked. It worked. Uh, the other, once I became a believer, I studied relationships in the Bible. It was interesting. I've hardly ever heard one now, but my first number of years as a Christian, I never once heard a sermon on relationships, how to build
Huh.
relationships, how to have. I never heard it, and so I read the Bible and saw just some of the characteristics: time, spending time, compassion, love, and just as a kid, I worked those through. Uh, at school, middle school, and all, my teachers say, "Josh, why can't you be more like your older brothers and sisters?"
Oh.
I used to think they were saints, but I knew they weren't. But I was
Hmm.
always being compared to my older brothers and sisters,
Hmm.
and I think that would help you motivate you, cause rebellion on my part. I
Hmm.
just, I just rebelled all the more out of it. So I would say the scriptures and the models of other people is what helped me.
That's great. We've been talking about relationships and we've been talking about truth. Let's shift to the component of kind of teaching truth to this generation. I don't think I told you this yet, Dad, but I teach a high school class, and my son, your grandson, is in my class at this private school, and we're
Oh, that's
actually
great.
going through the abolition of man with C.S. Lewis. Interestingly enough, literally line by line. But on Mondays, they listen to a podcast that I host, and we just talk about it. And the topic last week was on passing on the faith to the next generation. So these high school students had never really thought about what their parents did to teach them about passing on the faith. So I was asking the whole class, they said, "What will you do that your parents did? What will you not do that your parents did?" And my son, he goes, "I'm not going to have so many family meetings. We have way too many family meetings." And a kid in the class goes, "Yeah, you will. You'll just call them family gatherings." And, I laughed at that. But he said two things that were interesting. He said, number one, I want to have the grandparents around. He said, I see how important my papa and Grammy are to my life, and I want to do that with my kids. That's the answer that he gave. And that study by Vern Bankston I talked about actually talked about the significant role that grandparents play in the transmission of faith, a huge role. The second thing he said, I'm going to ask a ton of questions, just as Papa did with you and you do with me. He goes, it just makes me think about what I believe. So it surprises a lot of people, given that you're an apologist. You didn't just tell me what to believe. You raised me and my sisters oftentimes just asking us questions and engaging us in conversation. Why was that your model, and why is that so important with young people?
If you do not pass your faith on, you've failed as a parent, but you can always work on it. Second, I saw what my faith had done in my life and in my relationship with your grandfather, my dad, when I led him to Christ. And for a year and a half, we had the most incredible father-son relationship, but only for 14 months. And so one of the things I knew made a difference in my life was convictions. And so I felt I needed to develop convictions in y'all's lives on truth, on the Bible, on Christ, on what is truth even. I remember many of our discussions on that, and the scriptures in Christ and the Bible, I mean, God, everything. And so to do that, one, I knew, as I've already mentioned these two things, I needed to model it, and I needed to develop a relationship, which that wasn't easy for me because I never had it with my dad. And it's much easier to do it when you've had it with your own father. And so develop relationships. And then there were two apart from that. I had to instill convictions. In other words, the difference between a belief and convictions. Most young people grow up with beliefs. I believe what my dad does, my mom, I believe this, I believe that. A conviction is not just knowing what you believe, but knowing why you believe it. It's having the whys, not just the what's answered. And so I knew I had to ingrain things into you about Christ, the scriptures, the resurrection, everything, but I had to get the whys in it. So that you do that through process. You think of that. You don't just do it by teaching, you do it by process, interacting. This is why we would go, say, we lived up in Julian, and if we went to a ball game, it was a 35-minute drive down the mountain. And so I always planned on conversations in those drives. I would form a question, and then we'd interact on it. And for me, that was part of the process of getting each one of my kids to internalize the truth we talked about. On the way to the science fair, everything. We interacted all the time in the car. I took you all to see, I took you down to Ramona in that old theater right when Schindler's List came out.
Yeah, Schindler's List.
I took you to, boy, I get a lot of criticism from parents. I can't believe you took your child to see Schindler's List with the immorality in there and everything. And I said, well, I'd do it again. We went to Schindler's List. And if you recall, we went to was it called Mr. Steakhouse or whatever it is, right there?
I think it was a Sizzler's, right?
Sizzler, yes. Right up from the movie theater. And we sat there for over 3 hours. I'll never forget it. Over 3 hours. And I started out by asking the question, what did you think of the movie? And I listened to you. And then we gave our order. And as the waiter walked away, I said, what do you think the Holocaust was wrong, the killing of 6 million Jews? And of course, you said yes. So I said, why? Why is it wrong? And that ended up to be, just from that part, 2 hour and 15-minute conversation. Why is it wrong to kill? Why was it wrong to slaughter 6 million Jews, etc.? And I believe out of that very conversation, you developed a lot of your initial convictions about right and wrong in killing and the way we treat people. And I remember we were standing at the cafe there in Julian. You walk through a little place, and then there was a cafe. And somebody said something about killing something. And you spoke right up and said, well, Dad, that's wrong. And I said, why? And you iterated our conversation at the Sizzler part of it.
Wow.
And I walked away saying, wow, it's stuck. And so I believe you need to model it. And on a model, you need to build a relationship. You need to teach convictions. You need to teach truth, but then you must process it. You must interact on it.
That makes a lot of sense. Right now, with this generation, so much information at their fingertips. It's not enough to just give them information and answers, because they can find information anywhere. What I focus on with my students is, how do I help them become better thinkers? How do I help them become better readers? How do I help them gain wisdom? So I mentioned this earlier, but I teach at Biola University full time, Talbot School of Theology, the two together, and I teach one high school class of 17 and 8-year-olds, 17 and 18-year-olds at a private Christian school. And it's a Bible class, and we're actually going through The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. Now, I'm assuming all of you have read C.S. Lewis, but if you haven't read Abolition of Man, that is one of his hardest books. It's a difficult book. And we spent about 2.5 weeks just on chapter 1. I have him read it multiple times, and we are dissecting it line by line. And I'm pointing out, here's how you read. Here's how you understand. How would you answer this? And it's a process through all of it that's tough. And I'm challenging them to go deeper than they think they can go. And all but maybe one or two of them are responding. There's a couple kids, I think the jury's still out if it's worth the effort. But I think almost all of them are like, you're teaching me how to think, realizing that there's only a certain reward that comes from putting effort into something. And I think that's what you and Mom tried to do, and I try to do with our kids as well. So let's talk about what this looks like. Let me give a practical example of how I did this recently.
With a computer,
And
Sean, with
yeah,
so much with the internet and the computer, you can gather content, information, but it's very difficult to process it
that's right.
with a computer.
Because the thinking is fragmented. It goes from one blog link to another. It's fragmented and it's not linear. So in this class that is sometimes 90 minutes, I will sit there with the students. No technology is out and teach them how to think and process an idea and not be distracted. That process is just important as any truth that we give to this generation. They need that space to think like that. Now, similar to that movie example that you gave, let me give you another example that I did with my son recently. I guess this was about a year and a half ago when the movie Bohemian Rhapsody came out. And it was the movie about the rock band Queen. And it was PG-13. My son was 14 at the time. So I knew it had a little bit of kind of an agenda of ideas about sexuality. But as I read it, I'm like, okay, it's not too over the top. So Scotty asked me, he said, hey, can I go see this movie? And I said, well, why do you want to see it? Told me why he wanted to see it. I said, okay, here's the deal. I'll pay for you and a friend whose mom is fine with this, or parents are fine with this. If when we're done, we just come back home and sit down at the dining table and just talk about it. That's it. We just talk about it. He goes, sure. So we go to the movie. We came back, and first I asked him, what'd you think about the movie? What'd you enjoy? And then I said certain things like, what do you think the moral agenda of it was? What can we agree with? What might we disagree with? I said, were there any times you felt you were preached at? And your grandson, Dad, pointed out, he said, there was one scene where the main character came out and announced, I think it was his wife at the time, that he was bisexual. And her response was, she says, oh, I'm so upset. I can't believe it. But I'm not mad at you because I know you're born that way. I'm just mad that the world is the way it is. And Scotty goes, there's no way in the 80s they would have had that conversation. I said, you're exactly right. They're pushing an agenda with this film. And that only came out because we've talked about it and I've taught them how to watch movies. That's what I think is so important with this generation. So how did you create in the family and the students that you talk with that doubt and questioning is okay? Because studies show that it's not doubt that hijacks a kid's faith. It's unexpressed doubt that often hijacks their faith. So even though you're passionate, confident in what you believe, how do you create a climate and a culture where questions are invited and discussion is valued? Because that takes some confidence that a kid might see things differently than you do.
Well, in the context of family, and you do the same thing, is I always emphasize, and as I do in crowd meetings, there is no question off base. You can ask any question you want, no matter how silly it seems or what. And as your father, I will do the best I can to answer. And if I don't know the answer, I will be honest with you. I'll say, I don't know, but then I always say, but I'll find out. There were a number of questions. Maybe 2 weeks later, I'd come back and answer them for you.
Hmm.
But just out of it is your attitude when a question is answered. Uh, it's like, oh no, not that. Kids will read your body language faster than they read your lips.
Hmm.
And you tell if you're upset with that question or you don't like it, whatever. And so one of the things I did, I always praised you kids for asking that question. Thanks for asking that question. Wow. And I was always trying to be, I never thought about that question, or I never asked that question. And then would answer it. And so it's being open to any question there is and being honest in those questions. If you don't know the answer, don't fake it. Lie. No. If you don't know the answer, uh, just admit it. Nobody knows the answers to everything. But then I say, no matter what, I can remember a question I couldn't answer that I wouldn't say, I'll find the answer. I'll find out. Well, one, it helps me. I become a wiser person. I become a more knowledgeable person. Second, it helps me with my family. Third, every question deserves a question. I learned if I did not ask questions back, I was often misreading you or your sisters. I would think, oh, he's asking because of this, when really you're asking it because of that. But I always come back, well, son or Katie, Kelly, Heather, why are you asking that question? Why? Da 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 da. Well, what was the situation or happened there or whatever? And so when I do answer the question, I know I'm really answering the question that was asked. And so those are things that help me. I think I've always tried to stay up to an hour over the years after a meeting, just answering questions so that people would see, because I always did 3-night series at universities. And the first night, man, they would crowd around you. And a lot of people wouldn't come up because there just was no room or anything. But they kept saying, well, he's really honest. He's willing to answer questions. He doesn't avoid it. He doesn't take off right afterwards. And I would do that with crowds. And I would meet with crowds, tell you the truth. That's a tough question. I'm not sure I can answer it. And a number of times when I'd be asked a question about homosexuality or whatever, I would respond this way. And I did it sincerely because I believe I said, I'm going to back away from that question because it's a very deep personal question to a lot of people. And it hits the very core of their being. And I don't have time. And usually I never had the time because to deal with that, you need 30, 45, 50 minutes to do it without being misunderstood or anything. And I said, and I just don't have the time to do it. I never had anyone call me down on that. Just the opposite. Well, I respect your response. And I know I've said to a number of them when I'm on a campus for 3 days, I say, well, are you free for lunch tomorrow? Let's meet, just you and me. And I did that, I don't know how many times, for breakfast, lunch, or dinner with somebody to ask a sensitive question. Sensitive in the sense that affects a lot of people. And I don't want to mislead or misspeak in that issue. So I never had a negative comeback on it.
I think that's interesting. The question that I know you're always asking is, how do I speak truth, but do it in a way that's relational and loving to people? I've seen that in your ministry, and that's the same question that we asked today. How do we teach truth in the context of relationships? Let me give one more practical idea, and then let's shift to the question answer period. Is my daughter, your granddaughter, recently wanted these shoes that are called Birkenstock shoes. They look like flip-flops, but they're like $100. And she asked me to get them for her. And I said, okay, wait a minute. That's a lot of money for shoes. And I thought about it. I said, okay, I have an idea. If you watch 50 of these PragerU videos, Dennis Prager is a Jewish talk show host, and he does these 4 to 5 minute videos. And they're on culture. They're great. They're on culture. Some are on politics. They're on sexuality. They're on One was on Planned Parenthood. They're on just important, timely issues. I said, if you watch 50 of these and just write a paragraph for each one, and then talk to me, your mom, or your grandparents about them, I'll buy you these shoes. She watched 50 of them. And because she had conversations with you and had conversations with me, she's like, Dad, did you know this about Planned Parenthood? And I just kind of played dumb and listened to her. And the whole point that what you and I are talking about is there are opportunities in front of us if we will just seize them. If we'll ask God for wisdom, if we'll focus on the relationship, like you said, shift from our world to approach their world, there are regular opportunities to minister to and to reach this generation. The question is, are we willing to do it? So let's shift. I'm guessing there's probably a
Wait
lot
a
of
minute.
questions.
One of the difference between you and me, you recommend your kids watch Prager. I recommended to you to listen to one of my talks.
Uh,
Well, I've had
listen to the resurrection, the scriptures, everything.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true. I've had them watch your talks and go to a lot of your material. That's for sure. But all right, let's go to Q&A.
oh, that's wonderful. It's been a wonderful time here so far, and over these past hours, just thinking about, I think, some really key concepts that you mentioned. One is the importance of asking questions, listening to people, finding out where they're at, dealing with truth, taking time to as well be in relationship with people, and sharing the gospel with others. And one thing I would just like to say, it's been wonderful to see the warm father-son relationship that you two model so well. And I think that's one of the reasons I think you've both been effective in sharing your faith, is it's clear that God has used your relationship and that modeling to be a blessing to many. So thank you so much, Josh and Sean.
I never
we
knew.
really appreciate it.
I never knew you could grow up and some of your greatest heroes in life would be your children. I never knew that.
That's
I
fabulous.
never knew that your children could become some of your greatest heroes. Hey, thank you. I got to
well,
go eat. My blood sugar is down.
That's good. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank
again. And we're just so grateful. And again, everyone who's been watching and participating, encourage you to consider the books written by Josh and Sean. And there are many out there. So please go check out their websites. Check out the C.S. Lewis Institute, the resources there. And we hope that in the days to come, that God will bring you many opportunities to share his warm, relational love and grace with your family and your friends, and that you'll see many more drawn to the good news of Christ in the days to come. Again, thank you all so much. God bless you, and go in peace.